What if revenge could be stitched thread by thread into the very fabric of a wedding gown? What if silence wasn't submission but strategy? In 1858 Mississippi, on the Whitmore plantation, silence was Clara's greatest weapon. She was a slave, unseen and unheard, except when her hands were put to use. That summer, she was ordered to sew a wedding gown for Elizabeth Whitmore, the master's daughter. Days later, the bride was dead. Some whispered illness, others a curse. But those who looked closer wondered, was it the work of Clara's needle? The air that season pressed down like judgment. Cotton fields swayed beneath the sun, hiding the cries of those bound to them. Inside the great house, Clara stitched by lamplight. She had not been born to thread silks. Her hands once harvested cane and dug tiny graves for infants who never saw freedom. Years of pain had reshaped her into obedience, or so it seemed. She had learned the art of becoming invisible. Her room was a narrow cell at the back of the house, without windows, the door locking only from the outside. Her days began before the rooster's call and ended long after the candles died. She served Elizabeth, a pale young woman with a voice sharp as shattered china. Clara never met her eyes. She always said, "Miss Elizabeth," always bowed. It was Elizabeth who had noticed Clara's talent. After Clara repaired a torn lace cuff so neatly it seemed untouched, Elizabeth clapped her hands. "You'll sew my wedding gown," she declared as though bestowing an honor. Clara curtsied. Inside, her stomach tightened. That evening, as the enslaved collapsed in exhaustion, Clara sat alone with imported silk spread across her lap. The wedding promised grandeur. The groom, a Confederate officer. Clara did not care for his name, just another man in gray who had watched cruelty and called it discipline. Beneath her bed lay something far more important, a bundle of cloth, wrapped around a button she had sewn. It was all she had of her son, sold 2 winters earlier. She had begged once. The scars on her back reminded her never to beg again. At night she dreamed of him, barefoot in the cane fields, calling for her. But morning always came with the sound of Elizabeth's bell. One morning, sweeping near the drawing room, Clara overheard laughter. Elizabeth's voice rose above it, mocking, cruel. "I sold that little boy myself. Told father he was too loud. I wanted quiet in the house before my wedding." Laughter followed. Clara's hands froze around the broom. Her heart did not race, it slowed. That night when she returned to the gown, her fingers no longer trembled. Each stitch became deliberate, careful, as though binding something alive. Whispers traveled through the servants' quarters of overseers who vanished, of blood hidden in cotton bales. Silence was currency, and Clara had become rich with it. She sought out old Martha at the edge of the plots, a woman who had once been a midwife but now muttered to shadows. Clara brought her dried tobacco. In return, Martha pressed a bundle into her hands. "Handle like sleep," she whispered. Inside were petals, bark, and oils, slow poisons that unsettled the body without trace. That night, Clara slipped the oils into the seams. Not to kill quickly, but to linger, to whisper into Elizabeth's flesh. The gown became both garment and grave. As the wedding neared, Elizabeth grew restless. She scratched at her arms, complained of dizziness. "Nerves," said the Reverend. "Bride's anxiety," nodded the midwife. No one thought to ask the seamstress. One evening, Clara adjusted the hem as Elizabeth whispered to her fiancé, "I've been having visions." A woman appears. Her hands are covered in red thread. He laughed, kissed her forehead. Clara lowered her eyes and finished her work. Later, in her small room, Clara lit a candle. From beneath her bed, she took her son's bundle and pressed it to her chest. Then she stitched it into the gown's final seam, close to the heart. She whispered his name, and the names of others lost, each one bound into the dress with every stitch. The morning of the rehearsal came gray and heavy. Elizabeth did not appear for breakfast. A maid found her slumped at her vanity, skin pale, breath shallow, her once perfect hair damp and tangled. "She's overtired," insisted her mother. "The body plays tricks when joy is near." Clara stood in the corner, silent. When summoned to alter the bodice, she obeyed. Elizabeth swayed as Clara adjusted the gown, muttering that the sleeves were too tight, that the collar scratched. Clara nodded with feigned concern. The lace was soft. It was not the fabric that burned her skin. It was what lived inside it. By dusk, Elizabeth collapsed. The gown still shimmered with beauty, but it had been remade into something else entirely. Every seam carried memory, grief, and vengeance stitched by invisible hands. Not rage. Clara had burned through rage long ago. What remained was colder, steadier. The world had taught her patience. And with patience, she had learned how to turn a wedding dress into a weapon. Some said illness took Elizabeth. Others whispered of curses. But for Clara, the truth was simple. A mother had sewn her sorrow into every thread. And when Elizabeth wore it, she carried the weight of every name Clara could not speak aloud. You've heard of haunted houses, but have you ever heard of a haunted needle? The doctor came first, a thin man with sweat shining at his temples. He peered into Elizabeth's eyes, pressed fingers to her wrist, studied her tongue. Feminine faintness, he declared, nerves. Perhaps a tonic of valerian. He advised rest, cool cloths, air from the gardens. No one mentioned the gown. No one noticed Clara in the hallway, still as shadow. The ceremony was not delayed. Guests had traveled from Charleston, Savannah, even Richmond. To postpone would be improper, her mother insisted. She'll recover. Elizabeth has always been delicate. 2 days later, they dressed her in the finished gown. Clara fastened the last pearl buttons, steady though her mistress trembled beneath her hands. Elizabeth's skin gleamed with a cold sweat. I dreamed of fire, she whispered, eyes hollow. I was walking down the aisle. The world burned, and there was a woman at the altar. It wasn't me. She was watching. Clara said nothing. She adjusted the veil, her touch slow, deliberate. The carriage bell rang. The family descended the stairs, radiant with forced smiles. Guests gathered in the garden beneath arches of magnolia. Music drifted through the air, muffled and sweet. Elizabeth stepped forward, then another step. Her breath hitched. Her knees bent. She folded to the ground with grace, as if in a bow. For a heartbeat, they thought it theater. A flourish of bridal nerves. Then came the convulsions. Panic swept through the estate like fire through dry cane. The doctor returned, fumbling with his bag. The reverend prayed. The guests whispered and were hurried away. Within the hour, Elizabeth Whitmore was dead. No marks of violence. No known illness. Only a body gone still in white silk. Perhaps, the physician murmured, the Lord has taken her to spare her from worse. The gown was burned at dawn. Its ashes buried beneath a willow tree that drank eagerly from the damp earth. Clara resumed her duties that very afternoon. Another hem needed mending. Another seam required care. No one asked her thoughts. The Whitmore house sank into a hush. Curtains were drawn, mirrors draped in black crepe. Elizabeth's mother drifted like a shadow, her voice worn to a whisper. The Confederate officer left without a bride, his name erased from gossip not by mercy, but fear. Clara moved through the silence as she always had, measured, invisible, necessary. Death had only deepened the family's reliance. One evening, as Clara aired the guest rooms, she heard the Reverend's voice through the study door. There is talk, he said. Some call it a curse. Others whisper about the seamstress. Her people were gula, weren't they? We must be cautious. Fear moves faster than fact, Mr. Whitmore grunted. She's loyal, quiet, useful. All the more reason, the Reverend replied softly, to keep her close. And so she was. Summoned more often. Made to serve tea during meetings, set to tasks already done. Watched, measured. Yet Clara never faltered. Her gaze stayed low. Her hands stayed steady. The more they searched her, the less they saw. Still the story of the gown seeped outward, carried in whispers to neighboring estates. Clara's name passed between lips, half in fear, half in awe. Her fingers are blessed and cursed, someone said. Her stitches hold secrets, murmured another. When her skill was requested by a cousin of the Whitmores, she was lent without hesitation for a price. At the new estate, Clara worked as she always had, silent, patient. The mistress there wore perfume like armor and jewels like chains. Her cruelty was quieter than Elizabeth's, but no less sharp. In the gardens, Clara met a girl named Hester, thin, scarred, her eyes too old for 10 years. At night, Clara tended her burns with salves Martha had once given her. The child never spoke, but followed her like a shadow. When the mistress ordered a black mourning gown for her sister's funeral, Clara measured the fabric with care. The silk was thick, heavy. She stitched as before, but this time she slipped in a different poison. One born of roots steeped in rainwater, stronger, swifter. It would not linger for weeks. It would claim her within days. At the memorial, the mistress collapsed. She did not rise again. Clara returned to the Whitmores with no questions asked. Payment had already been made. Hester was left behind but not forgotten. Clara added her name to the thread of memory she carried inside her. Years passed like ink spreading through cloth. The war came, and with it the unraveling of the old order. The Whitmore estate, once proud, rotted into decay. Cotton fields grew wild. Overseers vanished. The master drank himself into frailty. Clara remained, not by chains, not by choice, but as witness. She walked the house like a ghost through a corpse, unseen yet essential. Freedom arrived like a rumor. Papers were signed, chains unlocked, and still disbelief hung heavy. Clara left one morning, carrying only her needles, her son's bundle, and a pouch of seeds. She walked north, steady, unhurried, as if unthreading herself from the past with each step. She settled in Missouri, near woods where the soil stayed damp. There she planted Martha's seeds, herbs unnamed in English, flowers with bitter scents, roots that healed and others that warned. Children in town called her Granny Needle. Some said she could mend anything. Others whispered she spoke with ghosts through her stitching. She did not correct them. She sewed freely, and when young girls came, she taught them how to hide things in hems, how to listen without speaking, how to turn silence into strength. One winter, a young historian came, thin and eager, clutching notebooks. He had read fragments of an old story, a bride in Mississippi, a wedding gown that killed her. He asked Clara if she had ever known such a tale. She served him tea, bitter but clean. He pressed again. Had she sewn for the Whitmores? Did she remember Elizabeth? Clara smiled, reached beneath her bed, and brought out a bundle wrapped in linen. Inside lay embroidery, red thread stitched into flames rising from a gown, and in the center, a faceless woman beneath a willow tree. What does it mean? He asked. A dream, she answered simply. When he left, the image haunted him, though he could not name why. Clara returned to her chair, to her needle. She stitched a square of fabric, her son's name at its center, others circling around it, dozens, then hundreds. A tapestry of the lost, bound in silence and red thread. She never stopped. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and the earth, damp from rain, listened.